Hello, everyone. We're very happy to have ESPN back as a presenting sponsor and to kick off their panel on college football's playoff selection dilemma. With us today from ESPN are Jeff Bennett, Brad Edwards, Chris Felica, Dean Oliver, and Alec Pataki. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ginny. I'm Jeff Bennett. I'm a senior director in ESPN Stats Information Group, and I'm joined by Brad Edwards, who is our former BCS expert, now transitioning to College Football Playoff Committee. And Brad can also be as a host for ESPN Radio College Game Day. Chris Felica, senior researcher for the TV side of College Game Day. He's been traveling with that show for 18 years. And Dean Oliver and Alec Pataki of the analytics team, who create metrics for all sports, but the last 2 years have been immersed in college football. We're really excited to be here today to talk about a sport that's been kind of flying under the radar in sports analytics, college football. And there's tremendous anticipation around the 2014 season. We finally have a playoff system. No more BCS and debating about the polls and 2/3 polls and 1/3 computer average, computers that can't use as much information as I think we'd all like. Now we have humans that are charged with this incredibly difficult task of making these choices, coming to a consensus, selecting 4 teams, seeding those 4 teams. But how are they going to do it? And how can, we're going to talk about today, how can data and metrics, objective tools, help in that process? The second half of this presentation is going to be interactive. We have some blind resumes that go back a few seasons, and we're going to put them up there. The panel hasn't seen them. I haven't seen them. Alec's actually going to run that. And you'll have a chance as well to vote on the quality of these resumes. So we'll all be playing a mock selection committee. I can't make it. Brad, we'll start with you. You've been talking to Executive Director Bill Hancock, formerly of the BCS and now overseeing the committee. What have you heard? What are they valuing? What are some things you've learned in those conversations?
Yeah, what's interesting is if you look at the criteria, year and a half or so ago when we were first told there was going to be a selection committee, it started out that maybe you were going to have to be a conference champion to get into this playoff. And then a month or so later, it was like, okay, maybe it's not just conference champions. That's still important, but schedule strength is also really important. So those 2 things are what they're going to put the most weight on. And then as this thing has evolved, you see there's a list of 5 criteria right there that they've announced that these are things they will consider. But then you see the one at the bottom. They've added that. So we're basically at a point right now where whatever the committee members want to look at, if they want to just sit there and watch the games, make all their decisions off of that, they can do it. If they want to dive into the numbers and do everything based on that without watching a single game, they can do that. Now, the committee itself, I think, is an interesting part of this as far as how it's made up. There were some people who felt like this should be really football heavy as far as a lot of people who just know football as well as you can. I think they ended up with a really nice balance. If you look at that group, I don't know how familiar most of you are with them, but almost half of them have basically lived football. With Barry Alvarez, former Wisconsin coach, Tom Osborne, longtime Nebraska coach, Archie Manning, famous TV dad, obviously has lived football. Then you've got Pat Hayden, who played not only college in the NFL, was a TV analyst, current USC athletic director, and then Oliver Luck, who's the AD at West Virginia, who happens to be Andrew Luck's father. On top of all that, these are guys, while they don't represent a majority on the committee, I still feel like if they're unified in an opinion that this team is better than that team, I think it'd be hard for most of the people on the committee who don't have as much football experience not to defer to that expertise.
So last season, prior to the 2013 season, ESPN introduced a series of storytelling tools and metrics to try to get ahead of the playoff system and get our analysts and our fans to understand and kind of be more comfortable with some of these objective tools. Dean, talk a little bit about what the analytics team introduced and really how that works.
So a lot of analytics, a lot of sports analytics is kind of a shortcut for watching the games. It's meant to capture a lot of the things that you can see, of course, but goes beyond that. When we talk about how good offenses are, we use yards, we use first downs, all this third down conversions, all this sort of stuff. College football, with all the teams, all the variation in schedule, sports analytics is designed for college football. So some of the things that we did were to capture some of the things that go on across 120 plus teams and summarize them. So we have expected points, which is capturing how good an offense is beyond yards. It captures the ability to convert third downs and sort of things like that. It's familiar to a lot of people who have looked at the NFL. We have that. We have in-game win probability and such. We have ways of evaluating then who are the best teams, if Team A plays Team B, who's going to win with what probability. And importantly, we do adjust for the schedule strength, because if you rack up a number of numbers against a weak schedule, that's quite different than against a good schedule. So we put those together to try to understand the mass of college football.
So Chris, no one knows the college game day analysts better than you. You've been part of that show for 18 years. The main talent unit has been largely intact. I think that was Kirk Herbstreit's first season on the show as well, so obviously you have his ear and his trust, same with Chris Fowler. And I'm going to call you as an analyst now too, now that you've been on some well-deserved FaceTime on College Game Day Saturdays last year. Even were a celebrity picker. You're not?
I was, yes. I had about 18 cancellations in Southern California, but they came to me that morning and said, guess what, you're picking games, and it was fun. So I did not stab Corso, by the way. That was not me.
So that they couldn't find a celebrity in Southern California.
You go to Southern California,
but they found one in Fargo, North Dakota?
Exactly.
Amazing. Okay, but so how can metrics and this deeper data, how can they help the analysts that are used to relying on the eye test?
Well, I think that's the important thing, because when Kirk and David and Desmond and Lee, they're so used to just judging teams based on watching them. And ultimately, that's what they're going to fall on. But where we come in is giving them a little additional information on who teams have done it against, how they've controlled the game. When Kirk and I travel from the game day site to the ABC primetime game, we have games on the flight, we have games on in the bus. We have 5 or 6 games on at the same time, so we still rely on watching teams play. Ultimately, who do we think is the best team? But then I will throw out something about, well, here's what their win probability might be. And a great example, and I think we're going to refer to this later, is look at 2 scores from last year. Say you're flying to wherever. You land, Florida State beat NC State 49-17. Oregon beat UCLA 42-14. Both teams won nice and easily. Look a little further inside the box score. Florida State was up 42-0 3 minutes into the second quarter. Oregon and UCLA were tied 14-14 late in the third. 2 seemingly large scoring margins, 2 completely different tones of games. So that's the type of stuff that we like to look at. But ultimately, for those guys, it still comes down to eye test, but most importantly, strength of schedule. Who have you done it against? Who have you played? Who have you beat? And that really, it's something that Kirk kind of took a little bit of grief for a couple of years ago with the Northern Illinois comments saying that they didn't belong in, whereas you go back a few years before that, Boise State dominated everybody. They had great wins over Georgia, great wins over Oregon, beat Virginia Tech. They had built up equity in showing that they can beat top-level teams and played good schedules, whereas Northern Illinois didn't have that resume. So ultimately, it's how you look, who you beat is still, to them, the most important thing.
How well do they watch those games? When they're watching, you say they have multiple games up. How well are they watching those?
We will be able to pay full attention probably to 2 games at the same time, 3 games, and we'll have a couple ancillary games on as well. When we travel and Kirk and Brent are doing the primetime game, they will have a couple of monitors. With the week this year with Alabama LSU were in primetime, they had that game on in the booth. I was watching that game in the truck. I'm in their ear. Hey, here's what, Copeland just fumbled going in. LSU went right down the field. They gave away 6 points. And I'm keeping them abreast as to what's going on. So later in the night, when they're commenting on what's going on, they have a much better idea of what else is going on in college football while they're calling that game.
Brad, the committee says they're also going to have the ability to watch video, so they can't watch every game. It's almost impossible to watch every college football game, but I know they're going to make a concerted effort to watch as much as possible. We can only hope they're as dedicated as the College Game Day crew as far as watching it. Is that what you heard as well?
Yeah, I mean, they're going to encourage them to watch as much as possible. They're going to clip off games where they're going to take out the commercial breaks, and I think to whatever extent they can remove time between. You can't do it with every team now. Take out time between the huddle because some of them don't huddle, but to try to condense it to where they can watch as many of these games as possible. At home on a Monday night, Tuesday night, whatever. And keep in mind, most of the people on the selection committee have a day job, and they're not getting paid for this. So it is challenging for them. And I think one of the concerns that I have, even though they will have the opportunity to watch all these games, is that every member of this committee is over the age of 50. And where I think that's significant is that, like myself, I'm 42, but even I have a college football experience that goes back well before the BCS. And so for my entire lifetime, their entire lifetime of watching college football, the polls have always been extremely important. I think if you only have watched college football during the BCS era, the polls have been important, but the computers have also been a factor, and you've kind of grown to give those some consideration. But I just worry that because we're so conditioned to place importance on the polls with college football, that might be a trap that committee members fall into, because like everybody else, they're going to continue to see the AP poll and the coaches poll week after week after week. And whenever you watch a game, to the left of the team name on the scoreboard, you have the ranking. And at some point, you hope in the way that I think the basketball committee has done a really good job of ignoring the polls when they come down to selecting who are going to be the 1 seeds. I hope the football committee will be able to do that as well.
Dean, what's your line about the numbers? The numbers see every game or every play?
A human can see a game better than the numbers, but the numbers do see every game. And that's very relevant.
Right?
Yeah, they see it consistently. You do, as I say, there's sometimes adjustments you have to make, especially with the schedule associated with college football. But they can do that. And humans actually probably have a harder time doing that.
So one of the things that we did last year when we were trying to put together these team performance metrics was what's our end game in here? What are we trying to capture? And I think one of the real aha moments for us is it really were two separate questions. Talk a little about what is best and most deserving, how they're different. What's that mean?
It's good that we have Reese Davis up here on the screen.
Hopefully we'll show some video here too in a minute.
There was, we had a meeting, it's college football
watch it now.
Is he talking first?
Go ahead, play it.
Go for it. Okay.
Committee, what's deserved, what you've earned, versus how good you are. You're leaning heavily toward eye test.
And it's going to be an interesting debate for me is, do you go what they've done, or do you go, if these two teams played,
right.
If these two teams played, would that team beat that
the
team?
eye test. You're going to have some people that are going to say, hey, listen, regardless of who they have played, this team's looked really, really good, and they deserve to be there. And you're going to have other people that are going to say, well, look what Clemson did.
Yeah.
Clemson had a great win, which they're deserving of being up there.
There's a big difference between most deserving and best. Clearly, Florida State and Auburn are the most deserving teams to be playing in the national championship game. But over the 16-year history of the BCS, it hasn't been unusual, as McCarron alluded to have a team like, say, USC at different times, 2003 season, be perceived as maybe the best. In your judgment, is Alabama really the best team?
Yes, they are. And you look at the body of work and the way they played and who they played and how they manhandled their opponents the entire season long, except for one game against Auburn. That was an anomaly.
Do you believe Alabama's the best team?
Absolutely. I think they're the best team in the country. They don't have the best record. That's the problem. You have to be lucky to win a national championship, and Alabama was unlucky.
There's a growing sentiment that Florida might be the best team. There's a difference between most deserving and best. Here's the question I'm asking you right now. Who's the best team, Syracuse or Florida?
The best team, in my opinion, is Florida. The best resume today is Syracuse. It's unblemished.
That's about almost 2 weeks old. But the point is, this conversation wasn't happening on our air, that there's two different ways of looking at teams. So Dean will give a little bit of backstory about how we got there. We've also successfully brainwashed Reese to take from college football all the way to college basketball, too. So you see, it's bridge sports. It's really bridged how we look at non-sports issues as well. But talk a little bit more about best versus most deserving.
Yeah, it was January of 2013 after the Alabama-Notre Dame title game, where we were talking to Reese, who does both college football and college basketball, and he was we were asking him a little bit about college football playoff and Notre Dame, they'd lost, and where he would have put them. And he said, well, I would have put them in, they deserve to be there, but I would have seeded them fourth. And it was kind of an innocuous comment. We kind of proceeded talking about all sorts of other things. But over the next couple of weeks, we realized that there is this fundamental difference between best and deserving. And we get conflicted in our head. And I think at that time we were trying to build one metric that combines them. And they are separate ideas, and I think we needed to keep them separate. The team, Alabama and Notre Dame was the great example. It was a great year for us to really have that concrete. Alabama was the best, but Notre Dame was undefeated. They had a hard schedule, not the hardest schedule, but they showed a lot of vulnerability, and they really weren't very good. There are a lot of teams in the SEC and the Pac-12 and Big 12. They were probably better than Notre Dame, but Notre Dame had the resume, whether you want to call it a resume or deserving or a merit. There's a difference here, and as Jeff alludes to, this has permeated our thoughts beyond sports. We talk about it with regard to bonuses at the end of the year, bonuses versus promotions. What are those reflecting? We talk about, strangely, with regard to getting married. Are you marrying someone based upon a resume, you've been together for a long time, or whether it's going to be good going forward? And in some ways, college football changed my life.
This is interesting because I report to you, so you'll be deciding my merit, and I'm engaged to be married. So I guess now you're changing my life.
That's both ways. So full foreshadowing of our interactive game we're going to play in a few minutes. But Chris, I'm going to put you on the spot. You are one of these 13 people on the selection committee. You've watched as much college football as anyone over this now looking forward 2014 season. How are you taking these 4 teams? You're taking the 4 most deserving? You're taking the 4 best, or some combination of both?
I think it's a combination of both. And Dean alluded to a great example, which I was going to reference as well. I don't know how many people really thought Notre Dame was the best team in the country. They're ranked number 1. They didn't lose any games. I think most people thought the 2 best teams in the country were Alabama and Oregon. And Oregon had a late season loss. And they probably would have been the 4th seed. Stanford probably would have been in the mix there as the 3rd seed that year. So I think it's a combination of both. In my opinion, 1 and 2 should absolutely be the best teams. I want the 2 best teams in the country in the game. And this year it would have worked out where you would have had Alabama was clearly one of the best teams. But I think there is a place now for the 14 playoff where you can use some type of study and metric to say, okay, this team did really well against a very difficult schedule, and Stanford this year would have been the example for that. They went 11-2, won what a lot of the computers thought was the toughest conference in the country in the Pac-12, and they would have been in discussion for that 4 and 5. I think everybody would have assumed Auburn, Florida State, Alabama, 1, 2, 3 in some order. But the problem is, and I think the biggest problem every year from here on out is going to be who's 4, who's 5, and I think this is where all of these metrics and all these studies, our championship drive ratings, FPI, whatever other computer you have out there, I think that's where it can make a difference, because I think if you were put on the spot December 6th or whatever the bowl selection show was, I think a lot of people might have backed Stanford, who was a 2-loss Pac-12 champion, with their resume over a 12-1 Michigan State, who had won the Big Ten, who probably didn't have the resume Stanford had. So I think that's probably going to be the biggest challenge going forward is 4 and 5 and who gets that final spot.
That hair splitting is going to be really important. Like you've worked a lot on college basketball, March Madness. The difference between being the 4th best team in college football and being the 5th best team in college football is millions and millions of dollars.
It's funny you say that, though, because last year, how long has the NCAA Tournament Selection Committee been doing it? And I'm not even sure they got the 1 seeds right last year, with Gonzaga being that number 1 seed, and they said they were a lot closer to being the 4th one to the top one. But still, and Dean was mentioning earlier about human perception. If you have a team win the ACC regular season title and the conference tournament title, and they're not a number 1 seed based on merit, it was Miami, and it wasn't. If that were Duke or North Carolina, they would have been a number 1 seed over Gonzaga. But I think the allure of Gonzaga and the equity that they had built up over the past have had these great runs in Miami, who won one great season. So it's still subjective. And I think the NCAA tournament selection, they're going to have that problem this year with Wichita State.
I find it interesting last year that Gonzaga was number 1 in the AP poll after Selection Sunday, but there was a lot of conversation. They didn't fall, but there was a lot of conversation around them falling past the one line. I'm not sure that it's going to happen in the college football the first few years because they have that safety net of the AP poll.
You're right. Brad and I were talking about this earlier, is that he mentioned it before, they are so used to looking at the AP poll, okay, but the problem with the AP poll is they treat it like a highlight match, for lack of a better example. You lose, okay, you fall behind this team, you win, you move up, you go to the back of the line. It shouldn't be like that. You should reassess it every week. And this is when you could argue the merits of the BCS, what it did great, what it did poorly, what was right, what was wrong. one thing the BCS, in my opinion, had right was the use of the computers. The problem is they didn't know how to use them. By muting them, eliminating margin of victory, and saying, okay, well, you can use the computer, but you can't take the final score and parts of the game into account, that makes it useless. They had the right opinion and the right mindset in getting a computer involved, which was just taking data and analyzing it. They just didn't use it right.
We're going to go right to win probability in a second here, but Brad, one-word answer, or I guess 2 words if it's the other one. Is the committee going to take the most deserving or the best?
Best.
All right. Dean, talk a little bit about win probability. Chris alluded to the fact that the BCS computers weren't even allowed to use scoring margin, but he also gave an example earlier how scoring margin can be misleading, or it can penalize a team for pulling off the gas and pulling their starters.
Yeah, the concept of in-game win probability is simple. You intuitively do this. You watch a game, you realize, oh, this game is over. And the idea is we can quantify this. We did this. And if you use this, it doesn't end up with the bias or the concern that the committee had that you would run up the score to maximize your computer ranking or frankly, maximize your ranking with the polls as well. And that basically, if you get ahead, as I guess we're highlighting here, Florida State with 35-0 in the first quarter, that game's over. Whether you run up the score to 70-0 or it stays 35-0 the rest of the game, that game should look about the same in everybody's eyes. The win probability was about the same. And that's the thing that we can capture a lot better with this. We're not restricted to not using score. Our computers, we can do this, and it captures the game in terms of actual win probability pretty well. And it's a very useful tool that we did look at, and we will, I guess, use in some of the blind.
Yep, we had average in-game win probability public last year on ESPN.com. Alok, let's talk about strength of schedule. Now, the committee's been talking a lot about strength of schedule, especially early on, how important. We all know in college sports, there's a lot of inequity. It's not the pros, where there's only a finite amount of teams, like 32 teams in college. It's who you played, where you played them. It's important in college basketball. You mentioned Wichita State and Gonzaga, but in college football, it's critical. You have essentially a dozen games, and the conferences don't overlap enough. So how do you rate the quality of the opponent, and how do you balance that versus the performance in the game?
Yeah, so I think strength of schedule is something everyone intuitively gets. It's, some teams play harder schedules than others, especially in college sports. The thing is, it's actually, we can put out a strength of schedule ranking and people will say, oh yeah, they're ranked so-and-so in strength of schedule. But there's actually not a single, one way to do it. There's actually lots of ways. It's relative in 2 ways, that at least 2 ways that I can think of. Even if you settle on what power rating or poll or whatever you want to use, then there's the matter of a perspective. So take a team last year like Duke. Duke had a really good year for them. They ended up 10-4. An average FBS team would have trouble beating Duke. That said, Florida State, Auburn, and Alabama, as Florida State showed in the ACC championship game, not going to have trouble beating Duke. So is it a hard game or not when you play Duke? It matters what perspective you come from. So that's one way it's relative. The other way it's relative is what you're trying to do against that schedule. And the best way, I think, to explain this is an extreme example. So let's say a college football team had a schedule of 12 games. 11 were against D3 teams, high school teams, whoever, someone they really easy. And then other is against the Seahawks at CenturyLink Field, right? So is that a hard schedule or an easy schedule? Well, I think most people would say it's pretty easy. The chances of getting 11 wins are pretty good. But what if you were trying to go undefeated against that schedule? What if that was the criteria? Then that's impossible, essentially. No college team could beat the Seahawks, not that I know of at least. So the strength of schedule is relative not only to the perspective, but what you're trying to do against that schedule as well. So, we're going to show some strength of schedule rankings. There's going to be 2 that I'll show. We'll get into a little bit more.
Let me emphasize one thing that Alec says here, though, is there are different strength of schedule ratings out there. You're going to hear it from ESPN. You're going to hear it from everybody when you do college football, college basketball, strength of schedule. You should ask yourself the question, what does that really mean? Because there are the different perspectives and there are different ways of measurement.
Hey, one other thing on that.
Go for it,
the selection committee for football, unlike for basketball, with basketball, when that committee comes in, they give them sheets of paper that have all sorts of numbers on it. There's a grid. They call it the nitty-gritty report. Down the left side, it's got all the team names. Across the top, it has numerous columns. And it starts with RPI. Then your record versus the top 25, versus the top 50, versus teams outside the top 100. Schedule strength. ranking is one of the numbers on there. They make sure that everyone on the committee is on the same page. With football, they're not going to give the committee members anything. And so if committee members want to consider schedule strength, it's up to them to decide how to do that. Is it going to be something in their head based on how they perceive a team schedule to be, or are they going to look at Sagarin and USA Today, or are they going to go somewhere else? Everyone is free to take whatever they want and use that as a measurement of schedule strength.
Yeah, so just diving a little deeper, example again, Florida State, it's present in everyone's mind, just happened a couple months ago. So their balance of performance and the level of competition, hopefully you guys can see. The performance of Florida State was sort of amazing, right? They were undefeated. They won by a margin that hadn't been seen in decades. Their average in-game win probability, which we had talked about. The NC State game was the best one, but they blew out teams all season. So they had one of the best scores in that we've had in 10 years. But then you got to balance it the other side. Like, what was the level of competition? The ACC wasn't that great last year. An average team, again, we have the two perspectives. The average team would have won 6 or 7 games against the schedule. But if you look at it from a 90th percentile team, which is basically the middle of the top 25, if you think about it, someone like Clemson last year, Florida State's schedule wasn't really that hard. Like an average top 25 team would win 11 or 12 games. Florida State won 13. Now, to be fair, everyone's schedule looks easy from a top team perspective. You should win all those games. So you have to adjust everyone's expectations up or down. But you can see in the ranking, Florida State's schedule looks 66th, about average in FBS, and now it drops down to 80 when you look at it from top team perspective. So when you're thinking about how valid is Florida State's resume, you want to look at, okay, from what perspective and like how strong was the schedule. One way that we've balanced this is we've done this probability calculation, and it's not trivial, but it makes sense. It's what's the chance of a team. Now you can take the average team, you can take the 90th percentile team, and this is very important actually what you pick. But then what's the chance of that team having your record or better against your schedule? So here we did the example of what's the chance of doing, Florida State's record is 13-0. What's the chance of an average top 25 team doing that? It's about 19%. So it's still hard to go undefeated. 19% isn't by any means a guarantee. But for example, Auburn last year went 12-1 against a much tougher schedule. And the numbers showed that it was actually more difficult for a top team or an average team to go 12-1 against Auburn's schedule than 13-0 against Florida State. That's one way we can kind of balance the things.
That's an important distinction, because people that grew up with the polls, and there's especially in college football, there's like this loss aversion. Like what's the loss tolerance? You have one loss, and the stigma is you're not a top team anymore. You have to kind of have other things fall into place to climb back up again. But you show there's different situations through the years where it's actually harder to go 12-1. So I want more Alok. I'm turning it over to him. We're going to do our interactive game here. We're going to see some resumes, and talk us through it, Alok.
All right. So we're moving on to sort of round 2 of our presentation here. And let's see. Okay. So we want you to get out your phones. First of all, hopefully everyone's done eating lunch. We're going to be doing some text voting. The panelists are going to have whiteboards. And first, before we get into it, I want to set up the rules of the game, the information you'll be seeing. Our goal is to kind of make quick decisions, but we're simulating the experience that the selection committee is going to go through using real examples. So we have 4 examples. We'll see how many we get through from the last 10 years of data. Each one will have a question regarding the selection or seeding of the team. So there'll be 2 teams compared, 3 teams compared, and in one case, if we get to it, 4 teams compared. And we have to pick one specific question. Who do you take? Who do you leave out? Etc. All the data is going to be prior to bowl games. Obviously, if you know what happens in bowl games, you make a different decision, but you don't when you pick. A couple technical points. So we're going to have more than just sort of the summary statistics. There's going to be a section about top wins and losses. I have an example I'll show you in a minute. But there's going to be a categorization of wins and losses as close, mediocre, or blowout. Just 3 categories, just so we have some idea of how, not just who they beat and where, but how did the game go. But that's going to be based on average in-game win probability. As we talked about, we think that's a better representation than the final score. The opponent ranks are going to be on there. So we're going to say, you beat the number 2 team on the road, or you lost to the number 24 team. That's going to be in terms of the AP poll right before the bowls. So not at the time of the game. You might beat the number 1 team early and then lose 5 times. You didn't really beat the number 1 team. Sorry. And then In the case the teams are not ranked, we're going to use our football power index, which we refer to. It's just a way we have of gauging how strong the team really is. So if you beat an unranked, if you lost to an unranked team, we'd want to know if it was the 26th best team or the 120th best team. And then, like I said, we're going to act as committee members and select the best choice. Here's the important part. So each question, there's going to be a code. It'll be on the slide, so you'll see. One code per each team on there. So if there's 2 teams, it'll be there. And that's the code you want to text to this number, 22333. And then we'll aggregate the poll results. The resumes, again, are going to be blind once we get into it. And then we'll reveal the poll results. We'll have these guys talk, and then we'll discuss about it more. This is a practice. The names of the teams are on here. So this is not blind, obviously. Hopefully you can see it pretty well. We're comparing Florida State and Auburn. We've been talking about it all this time. Florida State, better performance. Auburn, not so great in the point margin and average in-game win probability, both conference champions. There's a middle section there with the strength of schedule. So again, we talked about it. There's different ways to rank strength of schedule. The first line is the average FBS team perspective, where Florida State was 66th. The second line is from the average top 25 team perspective. Florida State is 80th. In both cases, Auburn's schedule looks much more impressive. There's going to be a line for head-to-head. In a lot of cases, the teams will not have played each other. This is why this is hard in the first place. But in some cases, they will. Then there's going to be wins versus the top 25 opponents, highlighting some of their best wins. You can see Auburn has 4. Florida State had only 2. Now, you might think that they beat Miami, but Miami, sorry, Fleeks, they fell off towards the end of the year. So the 2 big wins for Florida State ended up being at Clemson and then the conference title game versus Duke. And then the one loss that Auburn had was early in the season. You can see it the week there. CC stands for Conference Championship. So it'll give you some idea, not just of what the summary results are, but individual games, performances, things like that. So everyone hopefully understands. You guys ready? Let's go. All right, let's tee up blind resume number 1. Okay, so this is simple 2-team comparison. Which team would you select for the final spot in 4-team playoff? If you guys can't see it, I got papers which we handed out. Hopefully everyone in the audience can see it. So if you want Team A, you're going to text CFB Team A1, Scenario 1, Team A, or CFB Team B1 to 22333, and that's going to allow you to cast your vote. I'm going to highlight a few things. You guys take a look and write your answers down on the whiteboard, but don't show them quite yet. We'll reveal them all at once. So in this case, Team A, it's actually an interesting contrast in a lot of ways. Both teams have 1 loss. Now, Team B looks better in terms of the point margin by about 10 points per game, but the average in-game win probability that we talked about is in the favor of Team A. Team B is a conference champion. Team A is not. Team A's strength of schedule looks harder from the top team perspective. Team B's strength of schedule looks harder from the average team's perspective. No head-to-head results. And then we see the top wins. Now you could say Team B, well, they beat 2 top 15 teams, and Team A beat none. But Team A beat 16 on the road in a blowout. So is that more impressive? I don't know. And then the losses, in the losses column, obviously Team A lost to the number 1 team. Team B lost to a worse team, but it was earlier in the season. They were on a roll by the end of the year. Are you going to leave that team out? So take a look. Hopefully you guys have texted in your votes. You guys ready? Okay. Can we take a look at the poll results? All right, we're about 2/3 in favor of Team A. Wow. All right, guys, what do we got? All right, we got 1B and Team A. All right, Dean, 140 characters plus or minus. What's your reasoning for Team B?
I actually do like the conference champion aspect of it. Frankly, I think that I figure it's more like the standard playoff thing that you see in pro leagues. I kind of view it as something that should get you there.
Okay. Anyone for Team A, you want to make the case?
I just like the fact that they have only 1 loss, and it's a close loss to the number 1 team in the nation on a neutral field.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, that's
you guys
that's
probably might even know who this is. All right, we'll go and reveal them. So, this was 2008. Felica knew. These guys follow college football real closely. So, we have the coaches there with some thought bubbles. It was 2008. Now, that was the year that Florida-Oklahoma played in the title game. There was a little controversy over whether Texas should be there instead of Oklahoma. In a 4-team playoff world, we assume that those teams make it there. But then, for the 4th spot, it would have likely come down to these 2 teams who were tied, as you can see, in the coaches' poll. literally tied. So if coaches were voting on this, this would have been extremely contentious. You can see Nick Saban's like, we lost the #1 team, we were up, Tebow, come back, come on, And Pete Carroll's like,
and they were #1 at the time.
they were undefeated,
and
12.
led into the fourth quarter.
Right. So Pete Carroll's like, we're on the win streak, we won the conference title. Mark Sanchez is still good at this point, so like let's all let's get us in the playoffs. So the coaches poll, you saw the vote, and the AP poll or the BCS were slightly in favor of Alabama. And again, the sort of analytics answer that we're going to go with here is that average team chance of the win-loss. We talked about Florida State, 19%. In this case, the chance of the win-loss is much more unlikely for Alabama. Therefore, Alabama's resume by that criteria is more impressive. And the key there is you saw 12-1 and 11-1. I know it sounds stupid. It's harder to go 12-1 than 11-1. All else equal. So that makes a difference. And the schedules weren't that disparate. So that's the analytics nod would go to Alabama in this case. Any thoughts, guys?
I think I beat Dean on that one. I'm
counting
that as a win.
Beat me?
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. I have the thumbs up on my side.
I'm showing my West Coast bias, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. All right, we'll move on to the next example. Hopefully you guys are getting the hang of it. Okay, so similar thing, 2 teams for the final spot in a 4-team playoff. For audience, it's CFB Team A2 or CFB Team B2. And again, it's the same number, 2-2, 3-3-3. I'm going to highlight a couple different aspects of the resumes here. So the difference now is that they're not tied in the loss column. Team B has 2 losses. Team A has only 1. That said, important thing that we talked about in consideration, Team B, despite the 2 losses, beat Team A. Not only did they beat Team A, it was a blowout. Not only that, it was at Team A's stadium. So, you can think about that. And Team B is the conference champion. This sort of points per game, averaging game win probability, about even. Strength of schedule, Team B's looks harder from the top team perspective. And you can go with the head-to-head result, but one thing you'll notice on the losses section, Team B, after beating Team A, had a blowout loss into the #5 team in the country. Team A had already beat the #5 team in the country. So the head-to-head isn't totally, once you take into account common opponents and stuff, isn't totally a tiebreaker either. So this one's certainly a tough one. You guys have your votes in? Still thinking? Okay, so the audience definitely vote. This was a good one from the recent years. All right, let's look at the poll results.
Landslide.
Wow, landslide for Team B.
I'm interested to see who this one is.
All right.
Wow.
All right. Okay.
This one should have
Everybody
been harder
have B
than
up
that.
What's that?
We all have B?
We all had B.
Everyone has B.
Yeah.
I guess the head-to-head result, is that the big thing?
Yeah, for me,
Yes,
because
And
this
conference
is,
champion.
yeah, I mean, for me, I am almost 100% of the time in favor of taking the best team.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to head-to-head, and especially, okay, if we're talking about for the last spot, okay,
Which this is.
if both teams are in and it's just a matter of seeding, I'm fine with putting the team that lost head-to-head as a higher seed. But if one team gets in and the other one doesn't, when you only play 12 or 13 games, if they faced head-to-head, it has to mean something. To me, it has to. And the fact that the team that won head-to-head also won the conference that I'm assuming that they both play in, that's icing on the cake.
I like the head-to-head aspect. They won on the road too, right?
Yes.
I think that really matters.
In a blow. All right, well, I don't think he's here, but Andrew Luck was very disappointed with your choice. You guys might have picked up on this one too. This is from 2011. So we had a similar situation where the #1 team was sort of clearly LSU, and then going into the bowls, and there was a debate over whether Alabama, Oklahoma State should have been the other team. In the 4-team playoff world, that goes away. But the 4th spot likely would have come down to these 2 teams, Stanford, Oregon. Oregon beat up on Stanford pretty bad. Stanford had beat USC, who then beat Oregon. You can see, obviously, there's also like player level factors. Would you want to see Andrew Luck in that playoff so he could face off against potentially SEC defense? Or would you want to see Chip Kelly's offense? Yeah, there's lots of other factors here, but the blind resume, is what it is. Now, interesting, the audience, everyone was in favor of Team B. The coaches poll in the BCS, as well as the AP poll, would have been in favor of Team A.
And the interesting reason why there is Oregon lost November 22nd or whatever it was at home.
What did you call it? Highline?
Yes, yeah, you fall to the
you
back of the
fall,
line, even though
yeah.
you're
So-
better before.
Right.
The funny thing is how the poll got it screwed up this year, too, even though Oregon Yeah, Stanford beat them this year, and Stanford had one more loss than Oregon did. Oregon jumped them in the final AP poll.
Yeah.
I guess they wouldn't go to the
It's
Rose
about-
Bowl and losing in the
It's
last minute.
order,
Exactly.
right? Yeah. So a lot of these metrics we do is we take away the order aspect. You don't necessarily control when you're going to play those tough games, but you want to take that into account. So also the analytical answer here is that Stanford, it's harder for a top team to do 11-1 against Stanford than 11-2 against Oregon. So not that that's the end all be all, but 11-1 and that one loss, the one extra loss, even though Oregon's one loss was to LSU in the season opener.
Do you have the adjusted in-game win probability numbers anywhere?
Yeah, on ESPN.com.
Yeah, they're not here. Because, you're hiding all the good numbers from me.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so there's many more numbers we should emphasize that you can use for this sort of thing. We've limited it down for the presentation, but obviously, there's a lot more you can look at. All right, now we're on to this three-team comparison. We are not picking one of the three teams to put in. We are picking one of the three teams to leave out. So certain years it's pretty standard that there are two teams that everyone kind of agrees on, and then it might be 3 for 2. So in this case, I limited down a little bit what's shown here, but Team A, Team B both have one loss, Team C with 2 losses. And Team A is kind of the most impressive-looking team in terms of the point margin and the average in-game win probability, but they're not a conference champion. Team B and C are conference champions. And despite the the loss, the strength of schedule, this is from the top team perspective we have there. Team A, Team B about even. Team C, much more difficult schedule. And is that enough to forgive the one loss? That's a selection committee consideration, things that we have to do. I should have mentioned, again, same thing with the voting. You see it on the bottom there. CFB Team A3, B3, or C3 to that same number, 22333. Cast your votes. And then some interesting points here. Team A, one loss was close at the end of the season. Team C has by far the most wins, big wins, including a conference championship win, including, top 15 type teams. But the 2 losses were to teams that were not ranked in the AP poll. Now, that said, they were ranked in the top 25 in the Football Power Index, and they were on the road. So do you forgive the 2 losses? Do you not? That's kind of the question here. So hopefully everyone has cast their votes. Want to look at the results? All right, so over half would leave Team B out. So Team B's fans, go ahead, guys, reveal. C, wow. So the audience wants to leave Team B out. You guys want to leave Team A out. And you guys want to leave Team C out. All right, let's start with Brad, Jeff, Team C contingent. Why do you want those fans mad at you?
I'm guessing at this point. 2 losses, I don't want to put too much stock in that, but I think you said, the 2 losses were teams that weren't ranked in the AP poll, but they were ranked in FPI, but not that high in FPI.
16th and 24th on the road.
It's splitting hairs. I don't have the eye test to fall back on.
Yep.
All
right.
So,
Brad.
It's not that they're 2 losses, and in fact they're both close and they're both on the road. It's that they have 2 losses and neither one was to an elite team.
Yeah.
I'm perfectly fine with taking a 2-loss team over a 1-loss team. In fact, I did it in the previous scenario. But I want at least one of those 2 losses to be to a contending team.
Okay. Are we leaving team out for the conference championship thing? Is that why?
And the week schedule.
Week schedule.
They didn't play a lot of teams, and basically if these are the teams they're going against, I like the resumes of the other ones.
Okay. All right. Let's take a look at who these teams are. You guys, this has come up already. This was just this past year. We have Alabama, Team A. Team B was Michigan State, and Team C was our friends from Stanford. So, Nick Saban there is saying, seriously, we lost on this fluke kick, missed field goal thing. You're going to leave us out of a 14 playoff. Mark D'Antonio's thinking, look, you were challenging our schedule, but our last game was against a team that hadn't lost in 2 years. We beat them on a neutral field. And Stanford's we have all the wins. Look at all our wins. Look at all our wins. We have a tough schedule. Our schedule is way tougher than theirs. So in terms of the polls, Stanford had no shot, really. So even though the audience would have left out Michigan State, Stanford, in the AP poll, BCS was 5th. In the coaches poll, which is really notorious for rewarding win-loss, they're even further down. Interestingly, And again, not the end-all, be-all, and not that differentiating here, but the impressiveness of record portion of this, Stanford and Michigan State are close, but Alabama is a little bit further behind. So by that, Alabama should be the team out. Go ahead, Brad.
This is where it's going to be really important that the direction or the directive given to the selection committee is that they are to take the 4 best teams. Because I think most people would watch these teams and they would say, Alabama is the best team of these 3. And if you're going most deserving, you might look at the numbers and say, you know what, Alabama's the one who is least deserving of being in. So it is important whether you're starting with best or whether you're starting with most deserving. And so given what we know about the selection committee and how they're going to be asked to analyze these teams, I would say that Alabama would have been in.
Okay.
Not that that's right, but just the way that they're asked to do it.
But
I think
exactly
that's
what we
they
talked
would have
about,
come
best
up with.
versus most deserving,
Yeah.
right?
I want to make sure we have time for questions. We have about 15 minutes or so. So it's okay if we skip that last scenario.
Yeah, I think we can skip it.
I think we've proven that this is hard, right?
This is,
Yeah.
So kind of what we learned before we take questions. The selection committee has a really hard job.
You want me to blow through the last
sure,
scenario?
blow through it.
All right,
Just
so
go to the
this was one we already talked about. Who would you seed number 1? And this was 2012. And I'll show you the 4 teams. So in the mock exercises where I did this is where I got the most sort of dissension. Some people like Team A, because it was Alabama, they had a really impressive sort of like dominance. Some people like Team B, because they were really dominant. Their only loss that year was to Stanford. And then Team C was Notre Dame, though they were undefeated. Some people are like, you're undefeated, how do we leave you out? And then Florida, though no one without the blind, with a non-blind resume would have put Florida number 1, correct? That year. But they had the hardest schedule and the best wins. None of them were impressive, but they won the games. So
There is a difference to seeding a playoffs, I think, than being ranked
absolutely
number 1. And
so
that's
just to
important.
go by, if it was the polls and the metrics, the average chance of win-loss portion, it would have been clearly in favor of Notre Dame as the 1 seed. But we talked about it. You guys probably would have put Alabama. And if you look at FPI, again, Dean can get into this a little bit, but we're talking about seeding the teams. You might want to seed for matchup. And if you want to seed for matchup, the best matchup, as Chris said earlier, was Alabama-Oregon. So maybe you should seed them 1 and 2, let them beat up on Notre Dame and Florida, and then you want that in the final game.
And I actually would have had Stanford in my 4 teams instead of Oregon that year.
Oh, yeah.
So
yeah.
It's
right. So
yeah.
even before I gave you the 4 teams this time, but that was just based off the poll. I wasn't. But there would be debate there. So anyways, definitely want to leave time for questions. I just figured we'd go through that, talk about how seeding can also be a different question there. So go ahead,
So
Jeff.
we have a microphone passed out here.
You can take us
From a
home.
summary, I think we've proved that this is going to be really hard. I think the challenge the committee is going to face is going to find new questions and new issues every year. Maybe what some criteria worked in 2014, it might not work for those same voters in 2015. They'll have to adjust. We think there's some objective tools that can help compare teams, but it also might just come down to a little bit of a beauty contest as well. We had the same tools in front of us and we had differences of opinion. And we're hoping ESPN and other groups that can use deeper data around college football can really elevate the conversation to a smarter conversation around really the qualities of the teams and really who should be playing for all the marbles. So open for questions.
One question that I have, first of all, I grew up in Auburn. I'm a huge Auburn fan, so I could be biased in this question. But one question is, do you consider if the teams improve during your season? Like the first week, they may play against some weak team and have barely win and have really bad statistical showing. But that seems to be different than if it happens in week 11. I mean, should that be considered?
I think it should. I think it was this year with Auburn because, the example of Washington State earlier in the year, nearly lost to them. They got so much better. You bring in an entirely new system with Malzahn and new quarterback in Marshall and entirely different group, and they got so much better from that LSU loss throughout the year. And I think as the year went on, that should you should be peaking as you go in later in the year. And I think that gets factored in. I think in the NCAA tournament selection committee. So if you're looking at a college football playoff, I think if you're playing your best football at the end of the year, that should absolutely get factored in.
And momentum is something that a selection committee can consider, that they can discuss, that the BCS model would not have been able to handle. So this is an instance where selection committee would be a great thing for a team like Auburn.
Yeah.
I don't know whether it would matter with the seeding or with the selection. Whether it's I'm not clear in my mind where that would matter.
To me, as far as like selection, if you're going on most deserving, you lost. You might be best at the end of the season, but if you're going on a most deserving sort of thing, the loss is still a loss on your resume.
But I think you can be forgiven for a loss more easily if that loss occurred in September and you're a team with a first-year head coach, new coordinators, and a brand new starting quarterback who had just walked onto campus in August.
Sure.
That's different
what if it's
than
not a very good team, though?
Well, they lost at LSU.
Yeah, I don't know.
Try the brainstorm.
All right, let's get a few more questions here.
Yes. If every team played every other team, this would be an easy problem because everyone would have exactly the same strength of schedule and you could really just take a look at wins and losses. Obviously, that doesn't happen, but the question is, given the information that you have, you could, conditional on that, create a model that basically would say what would happen if every team played every other team. And on that basis, once you had the simulated data, it would then be the easy problem again. So I'm just wondering if there's a way to think about this problem differently. Instead of trying to say you have deserving teams, the most winning teams, the strength of schedule, basically say, look, if we had all the information, this wouldn't be such a hard question to answer. Why don't we try and model the missing data and then answer the easy question?
That's essentially what we're trying to do with the FPI numbers that were put up there, is trying to predict who's going to win. And that's what a lot of the computer rankings were trying to do before they were not allowed to use point differential, for instance. Now, exactly what is the best model? I mean, we can argue over that. Obviously, that's an academic thing that you can spend a lot of time trying to improve it. But I'm not sure that completely answers it, because it's not necessarily a fair process for who gets into a playoff. Even in the pro leagues, they've defined what the rules are. You've got to win your division or be a wild card, for instance. But you may have the best team that gets left out of that process too. So there's always going to be this element of deserving and best.
I think something you said there was true, though. All one-loss records in college football are not created equal.
Yes.
I think that's going to be something moving forward that people have to pay attention to.
Why is best versus most deserving such a debate when in other sports it's always most deserving? I mean, you look at the NFL and you look at the MLB, even college basketball, the best teams aren't always even in the championship game. You can go to the Ravens or, all these teams that barely scrape by on the wild card in the MLB but make it to the World Series.
Because there's rules in the pro sports. There's rules for like a wild card, NFL wild card team that's 11-5. They know they're not making it if there's two other better wild card teams. Even if one of the division champs is 8-8, happens. Those are the rules. So you can't really debate it. You could make for a change in the rule, but that's for the pro sports. So.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the rules in college football is
people decide.
A committee or pollsters decide. That's why there's this debate.
Sometimes we've heard people say they take the best teams, but they're really talking about the best resume. So I think a lot of the language is still evolving.
Quick question here. Brad, you brought it up earlier. I'm just curious. You mentioned that most of the committee members are over 50, and what concerns me, these are great statistics, great data. Who's going to enforce the committee to look at this data?
I don't know that that's anybody's job. Where I think the data or the analytics are going to come into play, or could, hopefully, will come into play, is they're going to start off with best. And at some point, whether that's after 2 teams, after 3 teams, they're going to reach a disagreement where it's not going to be clear cut that this team is better than that team. And that's where I hope they will really dive into the numbers and they'll try to look for the best numbers possible in order to reach that decision. And I can't speak for the selection committee, but I can tell you that coaches would love average in-game win probability compared to scoring margin, just because it tells the story of what happened. I had the chance to talk to Jimbo Fisher, the Florida State head coach, the week after that game that we saw the graph of
NC State.
Against NC State. And I asked him, did you feel some pressure because of the BCS and all that in order to leave your starters in longer and run up the score? And he said, absolutely not. He said, first of all, I respect the sport, and I'm not going to blow out a team that has no way of stopping us. That's not good for anybody. And the other thing is, he said, I have a duty as a head coach to play the players who deserve to play based on the way they performed in practice. And when the game's out of reach, they should get that opportunity. And so I think coaches would embrace average in-game win probability, and it's just a matter of introducing it in a way that people on the committee are aware of it and can look to something like that.
And we have had a chance to speak to Bill Hancock. We presented to him last August, I guess. And we find it fascinating. But again, how they enforce it or what they use and give the committee is probably still changing.
I'm hoping that they go through the same hard exercise that you guys and we just went through, and they realize that a lot of those basic stats, it's hard to make a decision. And I think the stuff, as I said, Alec was hiding things from me that I know I like using.
You did it on purpose.
And that's what I'm hoping, is
Try
they
not
realize.
to overwhelm the people.
They're better.
A few more. That's it? Okay. One more? Okay.
We'll go last one.
How would you factor in, if at all, an injury to a key player, like in the last couple games of the season? Say if Tim Tebow had been injured in the last couple games of one of Florida's national championship seasons.
That's hard for a college football.
You know,
I know for the great example for the basketball tournament is the Kenyon Martin deal with Cincinnati, and they still got a 1 seed despite him not being there, and he should have been. But I don't know. It's hard to penalize. And we kind of had a little bit of that with the Jameis Winston story this year. What if he wasn't going to be available for Florida State? Would they still be a top 2 team? It's hard to penalize an entire team for not having.
It's hard for me to imagine a committee would do it if it was not a quarterback. That's the only position where I can see it being a factor. Another example from this year, Missouri. If Missouri had beaten Auburn in the SEC championship game and they're sitting there with 1 loss and they're being compared to other 1-loss teams, one condition with Missouri, their 1 loss was without their starting quarterback, who came back and was there for the end of the season. And that's something that could have been used to differentiate their 1-loss resume from others, because they lost in double overtime without their starting quarterback.
Okay, I just want to thank the panel here. So obviously, it's something we discuss a lot on ESPN as we go forward, so stay tuned. Also want to thank our own Matt Morris for running it back there, and from MIT, Kate Lewis and Reggie Farina. So thank you very much.
Thanks to you guys.
Thank you. And Dean will be here.